Hey everybody, it's Steve Presser here. Welcome to a new series that we are kicking off. We are calling this Perspectives of the Passion. And so what we're looking to do over the next handful of weeks throughout this Easter season, this Lent season, is to look at some various characters who surround Jesus through the entire Passion story. Today, what we're going to do is introduce what I'm calling Passion in 3D, and we're looking at some of the disciples of Jesus, specifically looking at Peter, Judas, and Thomas. And what we're going to see in their perspectives are some elements of denial, deceit, and doubt. And so if you're familiar with these stories, this won't be all that new to you, but the goal of looking at these individuals and the others in the weeks to follow is to maybe have you ask yourself, have you seen Jesus from these perspectives? And do you wrestle with things like denial or doubt, deceit of Jesus? And as we'll talk about in future weeks, there's a whole lot of other perspectives from those who have seen and walked with Jesus or been around him, how he has impacted them. What has their response been to him? But what I want you to do is not look at this as an inductive Bible study per se, but to use this as a devotional time throughout this Lent season to just do some self-reflection and see where you also resonate with some of the characters around the story. So to get started here, we're going to look at Peter and his denial of Jesus. So this is a unique story. It's actually written about in all four gospel accounts. We're going to look briefly at a portion of it from Matthew's gospel. So if you have a Bible and you want to read along, turn to Matthew chapter 26, and we're going to look near the end here where Peter actually denies Jesus. Now, in the previous verses, at like verses 30 through 35, that's where Jesus actually tells Peter, look, you're going to deny me even knowing me before the rooster crows twice tonight. And Peter gets really defiant. I would never desert you, never leave you. And look later in the chapter here, and let's see what happens. So we're looking at Matthew 26, verse 69. It says, now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. This was after Jesus was arrested. And a servant girl came up to him and said, you also were with Jesus the Galilean. But he denied it before them, saying, I do not know what you mean. And when he went out into the entrance, another servant girl saw him and said to the bystanders, this man was with Jesus of Nazareth. And again he denied it with an oath, I do not know the man. After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you. Then he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, I do not know the man. And immediately the rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and he wept bitterly. So this denial of Jesus, well, why is this so significant? In some respects, it's significant because Jesus later would restore Peter. You see that in John's gospel. But I think from the perspective of Peter, there was a lot taking place as Jesus has just been arrested. There's a lot of confusion, a lot of commotion and chaos. And as he sits in the courtyard observing all that's happening with Jesus, certainly fears and anxieties and concerns for himself and his own life and the life of his friends that likely were beginning to brew, and to brew heavily. Here's just a few thoughts, and it's that denial breaks integrity and challenges self-confidence. So it's a couple interesting things. When Jesus was arrested, they were asking, who is Jesus? You know, who is Jesus of Nazareth? Where is he? And Jesus speaks up and says, I am he. So there's a confidence there. And then when they see Peter and say, aren't you one of his disciples? He says, I am not. And so Jesus withholds his own integrity, knowing what's before him, but Peter can't seem to do the same. He denies it. He breaks his own integrity of who he says and claims he's to be. Because remember, it wasn't too long ago he said, I would never deny you. I would go so far as to die with you. And now's not the case. Fear and self-preservation lead to denial. When have we been publicly silent? while having the freedom to proclaim Jesus. This was an opportunity for Peter, but he was just, I guess, living in so much fear and concern for himself that he couldn't bring himself to associate with the fact that he knew Jesus. Another aspect of that scene in this story is the overconfidence in Peter. Never say never, right? And so he tells Jesus, I would never deny you, I would never leave you. And what happens? Real life gets the better of him. I think it also speaks to the ease of sin, and that's we become desensitized in our own sinfulness. We deepen it as we're trying to either lie or, sometimes things just go from bad to worse. And the insistence of Peter to have these other people believe that he did not know or associate with Jesus, it grows. If you look at the intensity of the story, he simply denied it. Then he began to raise his voice at them, and then he began to swear at them. And so we become desensitized over time when we start trying to convince people of our own lies and things like that. And so the perspective of Peter, it changed greatly as his environment changed. No longer was Peter insulated by the presence of Jesus and his ministry and leadership over him. He's now on his own. He can no longer hide behind the leading of Jesus. And so unsure of himself and perhaps unsure of his own safety, he willingly abandons his association with Jesus in front of others to spare his own life and to spare his own reputation. And we too shy away from time to time in our own willingness to profess Christ openly and honestly with others. And whether it's fear of not getting a job or maybe for keeping a job, fear of criticism from family or friends and just not having to hear the comments. Maybe there's a rebuke or a feeling of judgment that comes, like, oh, you're one of those Jesus people. Like, no one really likes to hear those kind of judgmental comments. Whatever it may be, it's those things, those fears, those insecurities that oftentimes lead people to deny or to at least diminish the fact or hide the fact that they have faith in Jesus. And so people do this for a number of reasons. The real question is, are any of these reasons valid? Is there any good reason to deny Jesus? And so we often admire these biblical characters like Daniel and how he just continued to pray, or the 3 men in the fiery furnace who beforehand would not bow to the king and worship him and his idols. Or Joshua, who stands tall and says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And we get awestruck and inspired by these kinds of individuals for their faith and the fact that they even risk their lives to stand tall and to stand proud for their faith. And then when the opportunities come for us, as the opportunities came for Peter, he shied away and he denied even knowing Jesus. And so maybe that's you. Maybe you've done the same. And so when we look at the perspective of Peter, we easily see that he was unprepared to stand his own ground. He didn't seem to have the confident sense in who Jesus was, nor the sense of safety and security within his own self as it relates to his faith in Jesus. And so we can learn from this story, take some time to reflect on how and why we may or have shied away from public professions of faith. Just a couple of weeks ago, we did baptisms here at Mount Zion. And I know for many people, they struggle with the idea of going in front of other people to be baptized because there's some sort of embarrassment there, whether it's just being in public view or something else. We've often said that baptism is the first step of obedience in faith. It's kind of like wearing a wedding ring. Will you say I do to Jesus? If yes, first step of obedience then is to be baptized. And so it's almost like wearing a wedding ring. We learned from Peter, though, that denial is not something that we should be embracing. In fact, Jesus warns us in Matthew 10:33 that whoever denies me before men, I also will deny before my Father who's in heaven. And so that's a pretty plain statement, and one that we should consider seriously as we seriously live out our life of faith. Another story that we want to look at is Judas. And with Judas, we see the deceit. Judas is found also in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but each writer writes of him in some different and unique ways. We're still in Matthew chapter 26, and we're going to look briefly at verses 47 to 56. So Judas has already agreed to betray Jesus earlier in this chapter at verses 14. He agrees to 30 pieces of silver to be paid to him by the religious officials, and he would be giving them a signal as to when they could actually overtake him. So in verse 47, it says, while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, the one I kiss is the man. Seize him. He came to Jesus at once, said, greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. Jesus said to him, friend, do what you have come to do. And then they came and laid hands on him, and they seized him. Now, the story would continue with some more details, but the point we're making here is that Judas was the one who deceived Jesus. That deceit later then led to remorse. And so if you look further in chapter 27 of Matthew, I think this is the only time it's actually mentioned where Judas has a response about what he has done. And so in chapter 27 at verse 3, then when Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, so now Jesus has already gone through all the different councils and meetings, and Peter has already denied him. When Judas, his betrayer, saw that he was condemned, he changed his mind. So here's remorse. He changed his mind and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. They said, what is that to us? See to it yourself. And throwing down the pieces of silver into the temple, he departed, and he went out and hanged himself. But the chief priests, taking the pieces of silver, said it's not lawful to be put into the treasury, since this was blood money. So they took counsel. They bought with them the potter's field as a burial place for strangers. Therefore that field has been called the field of blood to this day. And then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah, saying, they took 30 pieces of silver, the price of him on whom a price had been set by some of the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord directed. So Judas betrays Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, only to later then have such remorse. He's trying to undo what he did, and of course, the Pharisees, scribes, religious rulers, they say, no, we already have our plans in place. And Judas realizes that he has made a grave mistake. Grave in the sense that his choices are going to lead now to Jesus' death. And there's a lot to learn about Judas. And I think there's a lot to still investigate about Judas, because I think a lot of assumptions are made about him, especially when it comes to, was Judas forgiven or not for his sin? Was Judas, because of his suicide, condemned to hell? Was Judas forgiven because he never actually spoke the words to Jesus, please forgive me? And I don't know if I have the answer to all that. I have some assumptions myself. I think ultimately I'll leave Jesus to be the judge. But there's some things to consider and to think about when you think about the perspective of Judas and all that he went through. The first thing I'll say to you is, remember that Judas was, in fact, one of Jesus' 12 chosen disciples. And if you go back as far as, say, Luke chapter 9, 1-2, Judas, along with 11 other disciples, was given authority to teach and to preach and to heal and cast out demons. And the scripture says that they were effective in doing so. So I have to believe that at some point in Judas's ministry along with Jesus, he was a faithful, subservient disciple who wanted to honestly learn and grow. You and I also are, hopefully, honest, subservient disciples who want to learn and grow. Having said that, we still fall into temptation. And so I have to believe that Judas is, like us in a lot of ways, given that fact. He was given every opportunity, even more so than we will ever see in some respect. Because remember, with Judas's own eyes, he saw the evidence of Jesus. With his ears, he heard the finest teachings. With his feet, he followed the greatest example. And so he still yet betrayed Jesus. And so just consider this. He likely casted out demons. He was there to collect for himself his own basket of leftovers at the feeding of the 5,000. He watched Jesus walk across, if not calm, a raging sea. And he watched Lazarus, a dead man, walk out of a tomb when he had already been dead for 4 days. If those examples and many more we don't have time to talk about don't motivate you to honestly follow Jesus, I don't know what else will. But what we see in Judas too is that he is susceptible to sin. And so we have to examine the motives. What was the reason Judas betrayed Jesus? The reason was he was motivated by money. John talks about that in the greatest of detail in his gospel. So if you go and you read through the Gospel of John, he actually talks of Judas the most. And it may be because John had such a deep devotion to Jesus that he just could not help but to talk about the betrayal of Judas. But it was the pursuit of money. So we have to examine our motives. The heart is deceitful above all things. And one of the things that Judas loved the most was money. In fact, the scriptures tell us in John 12:4-6, that he was the keeper of the money. And so money was something that allowed a foothold in Judas, and it allowed to get a hold of him. And, it's like what Jeremiah 17:9 says, the heart is deceitful and beyond understanding. I often say you cannot, if you're going to live a faithful life, whether it's to God or to another person, you cannot follow your heart. You have to lead it. You have to purposefully and intentionally lead your heart. Because if you follow your heart and you follow fleeting passions, it can easily lead you down the wrong track. And you'll start to chase after feelings than you will chase after truth, which doesn't always and necessarily feel good. The dangers of greed, in terms of Judas, is what led him to betray Jesus. We're told in 1 Timothy 6:10, for the love of money is the roots of all kinds of evil. It's not the root of all evil, but it's the root of all kinds. This was definitely a kind, betrayal. The scriptures say to be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. Those were Jesus' words in Luke 12:15. He also says in Matthew 6:24, no one can serve two masters. You can't serve two masters. You'll either hate the one or you'll love the other, or you'll be devoted to one and you'll despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. And so betrayal is a breach of trust and confidence that often leads to moral and then psychological conflicts within your relationships. For the betrayed, they are often left completely shocked. They are hurt, they're angry, they're deeply grieved. And in fact, for a lot of people, when there is a betrayal in a relationship, it's often said that they go through the grieving process much like it was a death. And so the relationship that they once believed had been so absolute is now, in their mind, absolutely ruined. Every memory is just a big question now. Was this true? Was this authentic? For the unfaithful, though, the motivations that lead to betrayal are so expansive that we can't dive into all of it. For Judas, though, it appears that it was the pursuit of money that led him to begin small. And like we said earlier with Peter, that we become desensitized then to our own sin as it balloons bigger and bigger and bigger. For Judas, John tells us that Judas started stealing from the money bag. But he starts stealing small, and then perhaps a little more, and then finally he sees an opportunity for 30 pieces of silver just to give Jesus over. And at this point, you're in too deep. I think one of the other things to think of is, what's the capacity for forgiveness in this story? Maybe you've been betrayed one way or the other by a close friend, a relative, doesn't matter. Maybe you've betrayed someone yourself. And you might say to yourself, well, this was so egregious, I can't forgive. And I'll tell you that there is no situation that is beyond forgiveness. We see that from Jesus himself on the cross. He gave his life to offer forgiveness. And if he can do that and have the capacity to forgive, I'll just challenge you with this, that every sin that has happened against you is an opportunity not to push others away, but to practice forgiveness. And it can be hard, but the capacity to forgive is there. The other thing to think of in this perspective is the consequences of actions. Judas was so remorseful because ultimately the consequence of betrayal was that Jesus died. But Judas also had to deal with his own grief, his own shame, his regret, and it led him to choose suicide because he was so overtaken. And so deceit has a way of doing just that. When you deceive others, you can either push it completely aside, or it may be that you deceive someone and you have genuine remorse for what it is that you've done. And what then will you do with that remorse? You know, for Judas, it led him to hang himself. For other people who experience great remorse, they then come to Jesus, or they then come to those who they offended, and they seek genuine repentance and forgiveness. It's a sad thing for Judas that he didn't give himself that opportunity, because I believe had he done that with Jesus, Jesus would have found a way to forgive him and to restore him too. The final one we'll look at is the person that we often call Doubting Thomas. Doubting Thomas. Is that really all we have to say for him? I don't think it's necessarily fair. But Doubting Thomas, we see his story. It's written in John chapter 20. Thomas, it says, after Jesus was crucified and after he was raised, all the disciples were together. Jesus comes and meets them, but Thomas wasn't there. After about 8 days, though, Jesus shows up. So if you want to turn to John chapter 20, look at verse 24. It says, now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, we have seen the Lord. But he said to them, unless I see his hands, the mark of the nails, and place my finger in the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe. 8 days later, his disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them. And although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here and see my hands, and put your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe. And Thomas answered him, my Lord and my God. Jesus said to him, you have believed because you have seen. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. So I think it's an interesting story. You know, we say Doubting Thomas all the time, but remember that Thomas actually demonstrated some bravery with Jesus. It was Thomas who said, let us go and die with him. When Jesus was wanting to go to see and raise Lazarus in Bethany, because the Jews were looking to Jesus to try to kill him at that point in time. And it was Thomas who said, let's go and die with him. It was also Thomas who inquired of Jesus in John chapter 14. And he says of Jesus, well, where are you going and how can we know the way? So Thomas, to me, seems to be an inquisitive character, and he wants to just simply know the information. There's nothing really wrong with that. A lot of us look at this story, though, of Thomas, and maybe you've heard the expression fear of missing out. You know, you don't want to miss out being part of the party. Well, Thomas wasn't with the other disciples when Jesus showed up the first time. And because of that, it's not FOMO, but maybe DFMO. Thomas had doubt from missing out. And so he gets this bad rap for being, quote, the doubter. Doubt grows when we feel like we're excluded from certain experiences or blessings. Doubt is not the same as unbelief. Doubt is the mind trying to make sense of it all. You know, you're telling me one thing, but I haven't seen it. So how do I make sense of this? Unbelief is a matter of the will. It's a position that you take. I will not. And so I think when we think of Doubting Thomas, that's really what's happening here. Keep in mind, Thomas was with the disciples for 8 days until Jesus showed up once again. So there's a part of him that wants to believe, but there's a part of him too that just needs to confirm what is being said. And so one of the stories that I feel kind of resonates with Thomas a little bit is that father who brought his son to Jesus for healing. And Jesus says, if you believe. All things are possible for him who believes. And the dad said, I believe. Help my unbelief. And Thomas, as I said, was still with the disciples. And surely in those 8 days, they had to have conversations about Jesus' reappearance to them, the cross, the resurrection, all of it. And so as much as Thomas may have wanted to believe, he just couldn't position himself, and he couldn't bring himself to do so because he didn't have the same experience that the other disciples did. And so because of that, he couldn't have the same confidence that the other disciples did that Jesus was actually risen from the grave. But Jesus does show up later. Jesus welcomes your struggles if we're willing to wrestle with them. And he eventually met Thomas where he was in his struggles and then invited him to reach out and to touch him. Remember, too, that Thomas wasn't the only acquaintance of Jesus who doubted. John the Baptist seems to have doubted Jesus, or at least had his own doubts, his own insecurities as the end of his life was drawing near, because he sent word and asked of Jesus, are you the one who was promised to come, or should we expect and wait for someone else? That's John the Baptist, the forerunner of Christ, asking this question. So if he can have doubts, and if Thomas can have doubts, trying to make sense of it all, don't you think you can give yourself a little bit of grace as you wrestle with doubts? Because we all have them from one degree or another. So perhaps it's not so much that Thomas was doubtful as much as he had a healthy skepticism. After all, as we said, I think he wanted to believe. He just couldn't position himself to do so. So the story of Thomas actually has some quality or some positive qualities to it. And with that then is, don't allow yourself to fall into the trap of groupthink, right? So Thomas is actually the one who stands alone in all of this. The scriptures tell us in a number of places to be diligent and to search the scriptures, be a Berean, as we see in the book of Acts, see if these things are true. But don't be afraid to ask questions. Questions lead to answers, and answers will strengthen your faith. And the truth of Christ can bear the weight of your questions. If it couldn't, I don't think that would be a faith worth holding on to. And be willing to speak your doubts. When we put our own discomfort into words and articulate the struggles that we have, we can actually begin to seek resolution. You know, Jesus lovingly showed himself to Thomas. He encouraged him in his faith. He spoke truth that follow-on generations will need to hear. And, you know, he said to Thomas, blessed are those who believe who have not yet seen. And so he gives almost like this gracious rebuke to Thomas. Yes, you doubted. But there are going to be those in the generations to follow who are not going to have the same blessing that you did in seeing me. But they will be blessed in that they will be exercising faith, perhaps to an even deeper degree, because they have not seen me. That's a great confirmation for those disciples to physically see the physical resurrected body of Christ. You and I don't have that luxury today. And so I ask you again, well, now what's your perspective? What's the one word or phrase that you would use to summarize your relationship with Jesus right now? Are you experiencing moments of denial? Are you having those moments where you're shying away from your faith just to maybe save face? Are you experiencing the pains of betrayal within you? And maybe you say to yourself, well, I haven't betrayed Jesus. Well, any sin is really betrayal to Jesus. So maybe another way to put it is, are you numb to your own sin? Are you even aware that your sinfulness is a betrayal to Jesus? And then lastly, what about doubt? You know, maybe denial and deceit don't fully represent you, but you know what you are wrestling with, or at least you have some unanswered questions. And so what I hope is that as we continue through these next 6 weeks more to come, is that as we look at each different perspective, you'll be able to take some time to reflect on where you are, what maybe you're wrestling with, what do you have to repent of, What are you shying away from in terms of your faith and your witness, your testimony to the world around? And what are those doubts and insecurities that you have surrounding your faith? How can you then reach out further into Jesus? How can you touch his side, so to speak, to confirm in your own heart and soul that he is indeed your Lord and your God? God bless you as you continue through this study. Take care.